This is the sort of video where I have to ask myself, what kind of mood do I want to strike when recording the video? Do I want to seem very personal and reflective about what this means to me and reach out to the audience? What does this mean to you? Do I want to seem more kind of professional and pull on that deep background I have in political science and philosophy? The controversy of the moment is that Elizabeth Warren crossed the line in some electioneering shenanigans in her ongoing contest against Bernie Sanders, and then suddenly the whole left wing woke up and looked back at the long history of Elizabeth Warren's dishonesty and kind of manipulative and misleading shenanigans and said, hey, wait. All this stuff we were pretending doesn't matter suddenly seems like it really does matter. Most notably, little-known guy from Flint, Michigan, made a podcast reflecting on the extent to which the whole left wing had been choosing to ignore Elizabeth Warren's claims about her own ethnicity. But when you let yourself stop and think about it, it really, really matters. It matters that Elizabeth Warren put her name forward for a cookbook of Native American cuisine, indigenous peoples' cooking, that she submitted recipes, like to shore up this claim that she is quote unquote a woman of color because she signed up for and received the status and benefits of being a woman of color, being a part of an oppressed and disadvantaged minority, not only as a student, but also as a professor. Her employer, the university, formally celebrated that she was their first woman of color as a professor, I think in the faculty of law. And all of this was based on the claim that in some sense she has a meaningful connection to the indigenous people of North America. Now, look, in some ways, the question of what ethnicity really means is the same whether you're talking about African Americans or Native Americans or the Jewish experience or the Chinese experience. And in some ways, each of these examples, each of these questions of what it means to be a member of an ethnic group, in some ways, it's really unique. All right? My ex-wife is partly of African ancestry. Partly. She has never signed up for and never received recognition as a woman of color. I think if she were in New York City, nobody would treat her as a woman of color. Maybe once in a while someone would ask if she was part Hispanic or something, if she had some, like maybe someone would look, And you know what, actually, if we're being all the way honest, black Africans, when they met her, this happened a couple times during my marriage with my first wife, there'd be black guys from Africa who'd be like, they could tell. They could tell that she was in some tiny, tiny fraction of African ancestry. That did happen a few times when we were together. All right? So, I mean, you know, there's my ex-wife, and then my ex-wife's mother is twice as African, and then my ex-wife's grandfather is twice as much African again. But nevertheless, even at that stage of the family tree, people couldn't tell that that guy was African. In many contexts, he was treated as white. And then this funny thing happened called the Holocaust. And you know, maybe you never heard about this. There was this political party called the Nazis, and they started rounding people up and putting them into concentration camps. And this dude, my ex-wife's grandfather, he was put into a concentration camp on the suspicion or the assumption that he was Jewish. And you know what happened? His African ancestry saved his life. A series of witnesses came forward, including some people he knew who had some kind of connections in the Nazi party. I don't know if they were members or officers or what. A series of witnesses came forward and said, no, he's not Jewish. He's North African black. He's some kind of, you know, mixed ethnicity person from North Africa, and he's not Jewish, so let him out of the concentration camp. And it saved his life. But my point is this, you know, Elizabeth Warren claims to have more than 0 indigenous ancestry. She got the DNA test, and it is as close to zero as any measurable quantity of DNA can be. I really do wonder, with the quality of today's DNA tests, could it just be an error? Because it's so close to zero. There are all kinds of people who get DNA tests and they say they're partly of Spanish ancestry and they know they're not. Or they say they're partly of Asian ancestry and they have the records of their family, they know they're not. Could it just be an error in Elizabeth Warren's test? I don't know. But in terms of my ex-wife's family tree, already her most African known ancestor, that grandfather, he looked white European enough that most of the time people treated him as white, and in one remarkable circumstance, he was persecuted as being Jewish. What is ethnicity in the 21st century? What is the experience or even the oppression or the cultural knowledge that we're supposed to have participated in to be positively identified as that ethnicity? Even if it were true that Elizabeth Warren has one ancestor, great-great-great-great-great-grandparent, even if she has one ancestor who was Native American, how can Elizabeth Warren write down on a piece of paper that she is a woman of color and get these benefits from the university? How can she write out a recipe pretending that she personally has some kind of involvement with Native American culture and tradition and cooking, that she knows the cuisine? I mean, my ex-wife, I can't remember any time in her life where really, positively or negatively, her status as being of partly African ancestry had a big impact in her life. For me, the memory that stands out the most was when employees at the hospital treated us like crap, when she was giving birth to my daughter. And the irony was, the employees who were in a sense most racist against us, they were themselves North African immigrants to France, right? They were North African people, and they looked down on us like the two of us were both North African immigrants like themselves. So that was like, it was a really messed up situation, but that was more like self-hatred on the part of these people rather than racism in its conventional sense. And I could understand it from their perspective. What they did was wrong and evil, and it made what could have been the happiest days of my life, the days when my daughter was born, it made it a traumatic experience. Really, I'm not overstating. It was horrible being in a hospital where people were racist against me. They had all these stereotypes about North African immigrants. They kept saying this insulting stuff to us, and they were themselves North African immigrants, or the direct descendants of North African immigrants in that part of France. The south of France is really messed up about ethnicity. Totally different category. And I mean, they perceived me as North African. So yeah, if I look like I'm North African, maybe people use their imagination and they look at Elizabeth Warren and think that she's partly Native American. But be that as it may, how could Elizabeth Warren make the claim to knowing a recipe, to submitting a recipe to a cookbook as being part of Native American tradition, Native American culture? My ex-wife doesn't know any African recipes. It's not like her great-great-grandfather passed down African cuisine to her. My ex-wife's mother doesn't know any African ancestry. It doesn't know African cuisine or African traditions or African religion or an African language, all right? It's already too many generations ago for even my ex-wife's mother to submit a recipe like that. So how would I feel looking at the next generation if my daughter then made a big deal out of this tiny fragment of DNA that she has, linking her back to Africa? And it's legit, it's real. I remember one case very clearly where a black guy, he saw pictures of me with my daughter, and he sent me email saying, oh, hey, I can tell your daughter is partly black, is partly black. So some people can discern this in my daughter, that she has some tiny fragment. But how would I feel if my daughter grew up and was playing that card in the university, leaning into it, claiming to be a woman of color, claiming to be even African American, or claiming to be part of the African American experience? When she walks the streets of New York City, police officers do not treat her as black. Any of these people, my ex-wife or my daughter, there is no sense in which they can even participate on that level with the African American experience, and there's no sense in which they ever have in their lives. Look, I mean, cuisine is a funny thing. If you want to, I could become a master of Chinese cuisine. I have no Chinese ancestry, and then I guess I could submit to a Chinese cookbook. But this is getting a little bit weird and disturbing. Ethnicity in the 21st century is a category where perception is everything. And then it's easy to think in terms of a false symmetry, where we have perception on the one hand, and then we have reality on the other hand. But we're often dealing with a situation where there's perception, and then there's nothing real we can counterpose to that perception. Okay? Probably all of you who are regular subscribers to my channel, all of you who've known me for a few years, you all perceive me as Jewish. Okay? Guess what? I'm just as Irish as I am Jewish, but I'm perceived to be Jewish. Okay? I have a sister, not a half-sister. I have a full-blooded sister, and she looks Irish. She looks Scots-Irish. Let's be real here. She looks, we could even say she looks more Scottish than Irish, but doesn't matter, okay? There's a whole history of colonialism there we're not going to get into with the colonization of Londonderry and Northern Ireland. Okay, let's just say Scottish-Irish. Let's hyphenate the two together, okay? That's what my sister looks like, because you roll the dice with DNA, and that's how she turned out. Guess what my family name would be if we didn't have a fake name in my family tree? If I had my father's name, if that were continuous coming down the father's side of the family. My name would be McGinty. And I would have grown up being perceived as Irish or Scots-Irish or Scottish-Irish, right? And people would have said about me, oh yeah, McGinty, yeah, big guy. People would have just fucking used their imagination and perceived me as Irish despite like my ethnic features that I got. And probably, like if I was in school with my sister, if the two of us were standing there together, they'd probably, oh yeah, those are the McGinty kids. Those are old man McGinty's kids. Those are those Irish kids. And my sister actually looks Scottish-Irish, and then you just fucking use your imagination and perceive me as Irish. And you know what? Participating in that cultural identity, in that ethnicity, in the Canadian culture, I can imagine how that would have inspired me to move in a certain direction or even to exaggerate certain kinds of stereotypical behaviors. I can imagine that back when I was 16 years old and I still kind of drank alcohol and went to clubs and carouse and stuff, that like the sense of being Irish, of participating in an Irish identity, that might have encouraged me to get into more stereotypically Irish behaviors. As an Irish guy, I can imagine how in terms of like the politics of the day, because when I grew up, terrorism in Ireland was still a real ongoing thing. When I was a kid, Ireland and the clash between Ireland and England was in the newspaper all the time. I could imagine how maybe that would have been a bigger interest for me. Hillary Clinton's kid, Chelsea Clinton, I forget, the kid Hillary Clinton had with Bill Clinton. She did her PhD thesis on the politics of Ireland, the peace process and the terrorism and so on. For me, not an interest. Still to this day, not really interested. Okay, I can imagine how if my father's line still had that name McGinty, that Irishness could have been a huge fucking part of my upbringing and could still be part of my life today. In a sense, whether I cared about it or even if I despised it. But like, here I am living with this fucking name, McGinty. And probably fucking nobody would have ever even noticed that I look Jewish. Because we see what we want to see, and the same way people convince themselves that Elizabeth Warren looks Native American, people would have fucking convinced themselves that I look Irish. And the irony is, genetically, I am Scottish-Irish. I'm just as much Scottish-Irish as I am Jewish, but instead, growing up the way I did, looking the way I did, Judaism and Jewishness and the politics of Israel have always been this huge fucking part of my life, have always cast this huge cloud over my life. And look, talking about my ex-wife and my daughter, in their case, Africanness and blackness were not a part of their life. But maybe if they had looked slightly different, maybe if when you rolled the dice and the DNA came out, maybe if they had looked a bit more like their grandfather, maybe all of that would have been totally different, and the African and black or African American mixed race cultural experience would have been a huge part of their lives also. Elizabeth Warren lied, intentionally lied, and cultivated a mythos around herself of being Native American, of participating in Native American culture, of even representing Native American culture, even if it was only to the extent of submitting recipes to that cookbook as if she has a connection to that kind of cuisine and that culture. Elizabeth Warren promoted herself as a woman of color, as a student, and then as a professor, and then accepting accolades as being the first woman of color professor. And I think we're living through a period of time where we all feel the extent to which our participation in a given ethnic category is to some extent elective and voluntary, right? And yet it's still real and it still matters. I knew people who were Native American in Saskatchewan who looked the same as my current girlfriend Melissa, who looked 100% white European. Okay? In what sense were they Native American despite appearances? Well, for one thing, if you actually go back and look at the portraits that are in like the British National Portrait Gallery or the French collections, if you look at the painted portraits of what Native American chiefs looked like when they first had contact with Europeans and they hadn't intermarried with Europeans at all, they never looked all that different. The difference in the ethnic appearance of First Nations Native Americans, it's not that striking. It's very subtle. And the vast majority of people who have survived the genocide and slavery today, they are of mixed ancestry. We're not going to digress into the long history of why that is. They have some European ancestry mixed in with their Native American ancestry, and in some cases, they have 3/4 European ancestry. But I knew people in Saskatchewan who were students at First Nations University who had a meaningful connection to that culture because they actually did cook the cuisine. They actually were involved in lobbying Parliament, in complaining to the government about politics. They were involved in the activism and the protests, okay? They actually were going to religious ceremonies in a tent, where they inhale tobacco smoke and they chant and they dance. They were actually part of the culture and the politics. A few of them were struggling to hold on to the language. Too few. It was incredibly rare to meet First Nations people who were making the effort to keep the language alive, which is a tragedy, okay? But these were people who, even if they looked 100% white, and we have a really significant footnote there, that even 300 years ago, a lot of them did not look that different from Europeans. It was a very subtle difference in their appearance. A lot of them have a really meaningful involvement with that history and that culture and that ongoing political struggle. And yes, it's a choice. That's a choice Elizabeth Warren could have made. She could have been the world's most famous, wealthy, powerful, and successful advocate for Native Americans and First Nations rights. But to my knowledge, she has done less politically for Native Americans than Bernie Sanders. She's done less politically than Nixon. Richard Nixon has a really interesting history with that. That wasn't what she did with her life. Wouldn't everything be different today if she had enrolled, let's just say, maybe she could have enrolled the same university I did, at First Nations University, taking specialized courses in the history, politics, and language of Native Americans, of Indigenous people. Learning those languages is incredibly hard work, okay? So we're moving into a period of time when I think the standards for authenticity are once again shifting. And we have to move away from a purely negative assumption that you're only part of an ethnic group if you suffered oppression because of your appearance or because of your status as part of that ethnic group. And we have to move into a fundamentally positive view that you're part of that ethnic group because you chose to contribute positively to that political discourse. You chose to contribute positively to that culture, even if it was something as simple as preparing recipes, as caring about the cuisine in that cultural tradition.